Africa is tearing down symbols of its colonial past. Where there are names, they're being deleted or replaced with indigenous ones. This is happening in Burkina Faso, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire. In South Africa, 3 decades after the end of apartheid, a debate has continued over whether symbols of white domination should still stand as reminders of the country's painful past. Some have been brought down after protests. This week on the program, we ask, should symbols that remind Africa of its colonial past be removed? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, in the heart of Cote d'Ivoire's capital, Abidjan, a monumental shift is underway. Dozens of streets and avenues in this vibrant district have been earmarked for renaming. Landmarks which bear French names are just about to undergo a major transformation, adopting new identities rooted in African heritage. My colleague Wanja Mungai takes up the story.
More than 14,000 streets, 200 avenues and 35 boulevards in the Abidjan district of Cote d'Ivoire have been identified for renaming. The landmarks in Abidjan bore French names, but soon they will acquire a new identity. They will be given names with African roots. According to a local government official, the project has a twofold aim: to reaffirm Ivorian cultural identity and improve the local addresses system.
The street addressing initiative is inherently linked to our nation's history. By naming our streets, we want to highlight our rich cultural heritage. Notably, this is a paramount reason why several African countries have chosen to bestow African names on their streets. Moreover, this addressing project is designed to streamline postal services by addressing long-standing obstacles. By implementing this project, we will have the capability to assign unique numbers to all streets and houses, facilitating the location of addresses.
For this initiative, the Ivorian government has chosen important Ivorian personalities and significant historical events that have greatly influenced the nation's history. Locals say the program will help the Ivorian people move beyond their colonial past towards a better future.
I believe that retaining vestiges of colonialism is a constant reminder that we are yet to fully come to terms with our own history. Hence, I think that this initiative to rename our nation's streets is highly commendable.
Our colleagues from the East have recognized the importance of culture and personality in defining a people's worth. Thus, naming our streets after prominent African figures will provide the next generation with an opportunity to familiarize themselves with the individuals who have made a significant impact on our country's history. This approach will mitigate their inclination towards Western-centric thinking.
A total of over 2,400 street names have been selected and sanctioned to replace the French names. The Ivorian government has revealed that 52% of the names are associated with political, administrative, cultural, sporting, artistic, traditional, religious and scientific figures, while the remaining 48% represent values, concepts and other names. Wanja Mungai, CGTN.
Well, let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining us from Cape Town via Zoom, Wandile Kasibe, Public Programs Coordinator at Iziko Museums of South Africa. Also joining us via Zoom in Dubai, Apollo Nelson Makubuya, a lawyer, and in Abidjan, journalist Oliver Elise Bolugbeu. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining in on the discussion today. Wandile, I want to start off with you and begin by revisiting history. By the mid-1960s, many African countries had unshackled themselves from colonial rule. But 60 years later, we are seeing that the African continent is still peppered with colonial relics, of which some countries have begun renaming or replacing. How crucial is the removal of these monuments to the broader aspect of decolonization?
I think it's part and parcel of an important transition from having to delink ourselves as a continent from these colonial continuities. And it's part and parcel, again, of what Frantz Fanon calls in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, when he speaks about the fact that decolonization is not a metaphor. It's actually a program in action. So it means that the continent is beginning to realize that, in fact, we can no longer have that umbilical cord still connected or still being connected to the former empires. We must begin to have what I think African leaders have been saying, self-determination, that Africa should actually has that self-determination so that it can begin to imagine and also become the design, the designer of its own destiny. So we can no longer rely heavily on, Western powers to think for us and also, to name things for us. We need to delink from those colonial epistemologies. And I think that the 60s provided an opportunity for the continent to begin a proper conversation around decolonization. So the renaming and removal of these colonial statues is part and parcel of that decolonial project.
Apollo, the continent is beginning to realize, a moment of cutting the umbilical cord from colonial legacies. Do these monuments still serve any purpose at all today? I mean, what kind of stories does their continued presence in public places in African cities tell to the current generations?
Kasibe has said it's a continuation of that legacy, an oppressive legacy, an exploitative legacy, a legacy of occupation and domination by one culture over another culture. And it's the continuation of the legacy of continued imperialism, if I may call it, because you see, colonialism ended in some form in the 60s, but it continued in another form beyond the flag independence. And so when you see us continuing to celebrate some of the oppressive figures in our cities, in our parks, in our roads, in our public spaces, it shows that yet there's a lot of work to do to undo the negative and sometimes exploitative tendencies that were installed during the colonial period. So you see that the education that we have, the economy that we run, the social and cultural aspects that continue in many ways in our countries reflect that colonial past. And in many ways, some people may say that there's something good out of it.
Right.
We can now communicate in English, we can do what Western people do, but it also has a darker side, and which we must be careful and we should be aware of. Because if we don't, then we'll continue many years after independence to be dependent, and I think that is the point that my colleague was talking about, dependence on the West for our thinking, our knowledge, and our identity. And I think that we cannot continue like that.
Oliver, let me rope you in here because Cote d'Ivoire is one of those countries that is replacing and renaming colonial relics. What is the thinking in Cote d'Ivoire?
The reason is not essentially for the colonization. I think that the reason is cultural. But in Burkina Faso, for example, the reason is political, is ideological reason. But in Ivory Coast and Senegal, for example, the initiative is more cultural than ideological. Government keen to pay tribute to these citizens who have contributed positively to the development of story of the country, and also to imprint on the collective consciousness, particularly among young people, exemplary model inspired by the experiences of these illustrious personalities. However, in Burkina Faso, after the fall of Mr. Blaise Compaoré, the last president, the new master wanted to erase 27 years of reign of the latter, who was a strategic ally of Paris in the region. With the end of the reign of President Compaoré, Burkina decided to break deal with the colonized power, France, and one of the way inexorably involves to the rebaptism of important streets and avenues in the country which bore the name of city. So I think that the main thing is not to destroy all the colonial monument or rename all the street bearing the name of colonizer.
Right.
To do so is to deny history. They must be preserved for collective memory, but also to give credibility to the history of Africa. Because in truth, our country were colonized, and that is our story. Then it is necessary to assign names of personality from sport, political, or culture who have had a positive impact on our country and the continent. In conclusion, we must emerge from victimization, accept our story, and move forward. Asian countries have succeeded. We also have the capacity to succeed.
Wandile, let me get your view here. Does this amount to erasure of history here?
The presence of these statues currently is an erasure of the histories of indigenous peoples. I'm talking now specifically here in Southern Africa. You find, for example, the statues of Jan van Riebeeck. You find the statues of Cecil John Rhodes. You find the statues of Jan Smuts. You find the statues of Queen Elizabeth. And you name them, they're endless. And historically, these are people who committed acts of, violent acts against indigenous and African people. And the question that, of course, that we need to ask is, when will Africa arrive at a conclusion that we need to have historical justice? So this is basically a question of historical justice. And people have said, no, there are good things about, this and that. But we actually had to answer a specific question in 2015. People were saying, look, you have the Rhodes Scholarship. And then we said, no, Rhodes' money is not his money. It's money that was exploited at the expense of our ancestors. And therefore, the Rhodes Scholarship, the wealth that he accumulated, is not his money. It's our money as offspring of the ancestors that Cecil John Rhodes exploited. And then we said to students, they must take that scholarship because it's the money that was actually acquired through an extensive exploitative process where our people were exploited in the mines, in the diamond and gold mines, where Cecil John Rhodes actually owned most of those companies. And therefore, that money is not his, it's actually our money. We cannot, as a continent, continue to celebrate these colonial figures in public spaces. In South Africa, there were debates to say, where do we take these colonial statues to? Because that conversation is still on, and the government is still now trying to come up with a proposal to say, should we take this to some kind of a park so that they are not actually superimposed in public spaces? And we're saying as young activists, no, we don't want this in public spaces because they are superimposed there. We don't want them there because these are figures that represent people who actually committed acts of violent genocide against our people. So why should we celebrate them? In Germany, the state took a decision there that there should never be a statue of Hitler in public space, in any space in Germany. Why can't we do the same with all these colonial symbols? Because these people committed almost, the same acts of violence against African people. Then why should we have them here in South Africa, for example?
So, Paul, I want to get to your view here, though. What alternative symbols are being proposed here or adopted as we erase or replace the monuments, that are being taken down now across the continent?
I can give you thousands of ideas. You see, Africa existed about many, many years before colonization. And Africans, we have big individuals who have stood up and fought colonialism, who stand for international recognition in all fields, fields of education, politics, knowledge, medicine, and everything. I mean, you have countless ways in which we can identify and celebrate African heroes, but not just African heroes. I mean, they can be international heroes to the extent that they represent humanity, respect for human dignity, respect for African values and indigenous societies. I don't have a qualm about, celebrating somebody like Mama Teresa. Mama Teresa is not an African, but she represents values that are similar to ours, that are, universally recognized as humane, as opposed to celebrating people like Rhodes. The thing that Africans need to realize is that when you continue with this imposition, superimposition and celebration of these characters, it shows, first of all, a lack of awareness on our part, a lack of education about our history and what these people represent in a real sense. There must be a connection between Rhodes, between people like Lugan, between people like Colville, who in our country were responsible for these atrocities. And their continued celebration is, for me, a negation of identification of Africa's development needs and its history. So please don't get us wrong when we say decolonize. Doesn't mean Africanize and remove everything European, whether good or bad. No, we go for those characters, those figures that are responsible for the that colonial, negative colonial legacy that we have talked about already.
Right. So, Wandile, I want to draw from your experience here. You were involved in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign at the University of Cape Town, which started because people were upset about a statue, Cecil Rhodes, a man who believed in white supremacy and imperialism. And after a month of organizing and protests, they succeeded in removing the statue. But this movement was not just about a statue. First, what motivated you to join that campaign? And why are such efforts important in shaping a nation's narrative?
Rhodes Must Fall was basically an institutional critique against colonial continuities. It was not just about the statue, but the statue, of course, for us became a pressure point to address broader decolonial issues and issues of transformation at a university level. You must remember that Cecil John Rhodes was blessed by the Queen of England to basically, spread the colonial empire. And when he then became a leader, or rather a prime minister at the time in South Africa, he put together laws that made it difficult for Black people to live as dignified citizens, in that he exploited their human labor, when diamonds were discovered and so forth. So that figure then was represented on university campus, the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. The students, we then took a look into history and also the tainted history attached to this figure of Cecil John Rhodes. And then we protested and said we cannot have such a person being represented, being superimposed on us at the heart of the university, especially a university that is meant to produce African leaders. How can we tolerate such a figure? And then, of course, we put together all our efforts into ensuring that the statue of Cecil John Rhodes is removed because of the tainted history and the tainted past that he represents, and him being a leader who had committed acts of genocide in Zimbabwe, and also when, of course, he was here in the Cape, he became a prime minister in the Cape, and then he put together laws that made it difficult for Black people to live as dignified citizens. So we couldn't have such a figure. And of course, the Rhodes Must Fall started as a critique. And then we use the figure of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes as a pressure point, because at the time we had to address issues of decolonization at a university level in terms of changing the curriculum, because we realized that there were also bigger, deeper, complex issues that had to be addressed.
All right, gentlemen, on that note, we are going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll have more on transforming colonial legacies in Africa. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, Wandile Kasibe, Apollo Nelson Makubuya, and Oliver Elisi Bulugbeu. Apollo, let me come to you on the role of education here. To what extent does the lack of awareness about whitewashed history in Uganda, as you've highlighted in a previous interview, hinder the efforts towards decolonization? And what role do you think education should play in addressing this issue?
Education is key to the liberation of our continent, to the decolonization process, and to the creation of new narratives of our history, of our societies. Education is a tool. It's a tool for expanding knowledge, for inculcating knowledge, and it was used very, very effectively during the colonial process, whereby the West and Western values and Western philosophies were seen as super over and above those of Africans. the education embedded within our minds, and understanding that Africans and African indigenous systems and traditional societies were primitive, backward, and their cultures were repugnant to some kind of moral standard that was set by the West. So we have to unlearn all these things, and the way we study in school, in universities, in all sorts of educational systems must help us to undo these negative approaches and narratives about Africans and African society.
Right. So, Oliver, coming back to Francophone West Africa, because we do know the Francophone West Africa has been very much intertwined with France up to very recently. What is the feeling, though, from the ordinary people regarding what is happening in Senegal, in Burkina Faso, in Benin, or in Cote d'Ivoire?
I think that the remaining all monument roads and building by the name of African historical figure who embody values such as freedom, dignity, peace and justice, this initiative could be led by the African Union. But I think we need to think further. Rather than just renaming the streets, we must further promote the instrument of good governance and democracy. As countries such as Mauritius, Cape Verde and Botswana are doing so well. That is very important for me. I think that after what we can say about the monument, the name of colonize and other things, what is very important for us in Africa and precisely in west of Africa is good governance and democracy. That is our very, very important point.
Apollo, do you think countries, or African countries, should establish independent bodies to systematically review all the monuments, all the roads and the buildings? What should be the way forward here?
I think my answer to that question is a definite yes. We must be conscious and do something deliberately. We cannot allow for this to be the lone duty of scholars, of academicians, of individual activists, and so on. There needs to be a collective effort, even at the government level, to see that the process of decolonization is embarked on and in a more comprehensive way.
Wandile, your view?
In South Africa, we've even gone as far, the renaming of streets, buildings, and institutions is currently happening. We've even gone as far as saying we must actually go even as far as rewriting history. The history that is being written about the earliest interaction between those who arrived, the likes of Jan van Riebeeck, and those who came before and after him, is the kind of history that depicted our people as people who were disorganized, people who were, who couldn't think, who couldn't put together strategies and so forth. But when we go into history, we realize that in fact our people, even as early as 1510, when Francisco de Almeida arrived in the Cape, he actually met people who could actually fight with him, because he actually tried to steal things by force. And then he was met, and he lost his life and the rest of his crew members because of the fact that he tried to emit violence. And these are the kinds of histories that are not being written about, because the people who wrote about our history, they wrote history from their own colonial perspective and through their lens. And we are saying that aspects of history must also be rewritten, so that we can begin to reflect a true history of this country. And that's why the decolonial process and project, as Fanon puts it, that it's a replacement. I mean, we're talking about a project that should be, effected through action. It's
right.
Not a theoretical exercise. It means that things must be renamed, things must be returned, and we even talk about issues of restitution. Institutions that have stolen things from the continent, not just things, but we're also talking about human remains of our ancestors, the skeletons of our ancestors, are locked in museums today and scientific institutions, and those must be returned, because we cannot even speak about freedom when our ancestors are being locked in museological prisons and universities and scientific institutions across the world. They must be returned, together with those artifacts and funerary objects that should never be in museums in the first place. They must be returned and reburied so that we can heal. So the project is even bigger than just renaming things.
Right.
We are here to say the continent must begin to have a new rebirth or giving birth to new ethos. That's what we're speaking about, so that the continent can delink itself from those colonial continuities.
So I want to get your final thoughts as we wind up the program. And Apollo, let me start off with you. A lot has been spoken about a rebirth and how to move forward. But how can we create a balance, though, between acknowledging this harsh past that you've talked about and promoting a future that is free from the psychological impact of these monuments and these symbols of colonialism?
These conversations need to continue between Africans and the West and other parts of the world. But most importantly, we need to acknowledge, we need to understand what these histories really represent, and the injustices of these histories must be addressed. And it's not just a road renaming kind of exercise. We must understand how we as a people have been disadvantaged because of these histories. And I think that once we have that knowledge, then there must be some acceptance on part of the people, the former colonial masters and the people who benefited from this legacy, to compensate and to apologize where necessary and to do what is needed to recognize that this history was exploitative and oppressive to the people where it was practiced. And that way, we make sure that there's justice in the world. These injustices are addressed, and moving ahead, we recognize humanity for whatever it is, not just black and discriminative tendencies that have been perpetuated over the many years.
Wandile, your thoughts?
Firstly, we must call for reparations. And secondly, I will quote two quotes from Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral. Amilcar Cabral says, whenever we act, we must act as if we answer to our ancestors, the children and the unborn. We must begin to make claims, because the continent, we are continuing from the struggles of those who came before us. Frantz Fanon says, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. The time has come for this generation of scholars to begin to fulfill that which they have discovered as a generation. And today we must actually call for the restoration of Africa's dignity.
All right. Oliver, you have the final word.
We must emerge from victimization, accept our story, and move forward. That is important for African. Continue to build our country, continue to build our continent. It's very important for us.
Thank you all so very much for that discussion. But that's all we have time for on this special edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests in Cape Town, Wandile Kasibe, Public Programs Coordinator at Iziko Museums of South Africa. In Dubai, Apollo Nelson Makubuya, a lawyer, and in Abidjan, Oliver Elisi Bulugbeu, journalist and political analyst. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, formerly known as Twitter. You can also watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.